Hello, my name is John Bryant. I am an interviewer for the Public Library of Cincinnati and Hamilton County. Today I am interviewing Mr. Carl Tuggle on September the 20th, 2006 at the main library in downtown Cincinnati, Ohio. Good afternoon, Mr. Tuggle.
Good afternoon.
Tell me how you came to go into the military service, when and where, and what you were doing just prior to that.
Well, I'd like to give you a little background of my upbringing.
All right.
Then I'll go into that. I was born and raised in Cincinnati, Ohio, and I went to Half Elementary School in Mount Auburn, and I went to Woodward High School at downtown Cincinnati. After I reached my 18th birthday, it was in January, and I was given 6 months deferment from going into the service. And after graduation in June of 1943, I had the option of going into the Army or the Navy. I selected the Navy because segregation in parts of the Navy has ended and parts of the service of the Navy was open to all branches. So I was drafted into the Navy and I was shipped to Chicago and went to Waukee, Illinois, where there's Great Lakes Naval Base. I went through 9 weeks of basic training there, and included in the training was the very basics of introduction of a person into the Navy. And after the 9 months there, I was shipped out. I was shipped out on these bases. During the 9 weeks period, we went through certain skills and we were given the skills test. And the skills test we were given to determine what we were capable of doing. After the 9 weeks, and we were back off of our 1 week of leave, we were given an opportunity for an interview to talk to a personnel as to determine where we would be sent. I passed the skill test, but at that time, I was deferred from going where I would like to go because they said all the bases were filled in that area. The schools were filled in that area in regards to them skills.
What school had you wanted to go to?
I wanted to go into aviation mechanics, and there was only one area where you could go into aviation mechanics, and that was down at Hampton Institute in Hampton, Virginia.
Let me stop you just for a second. Even though the Navy was now open so that you could, as an African American, apply for different areas, it was still segregated.
It's still segregated,
Okay.
That's right. And the reason why I wasn't selected to go to Hampton Institute, because they said all the slots in aviation mechanics at Hampton Institute were filled. Now, this wasn't only told to me, but it was told to over three-fourths of the individuals that were in our unit. So they called us back in for another interview a few days later and says, we have openings in fireman schools and in the service branches of the Navy. The service branches of the Navy are the areas of cooking and serving. Otherwise, being a cook or a steward. Now, them were the branches that were only open to blacks at that time. All the other branches were closed. So we said, no, we don't want to go into them branches. So we were shipped out a week later to Port Chicago, California. And I like to stop here to let you know that why we were shipped out to Port Chicago, California. At that time, in the Bay Area of San Francisco, the union out there were on strike. And the individuals who were on strike were mostly longshoremen who were loading ships out there. So in order to fill in for this gap of the longshoremen not working, we were put to the task of doing this. And at that time, there were no, I like to emphasize, there were no white sailors loading ships. But as has been emphasized here in the past, that they were, but they weren't. On the base where we were, there were not one white individual loading ships.
No, actually, in one sense, you were replacements for the longshoremen.
That's right.
And so the black Navy servicemen were essentially scabs, or even though it's not strike breaking, but you were really replacements for the longshoremen.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah. And we were informed by the NAACP in Oakland, California, which is about 35 miles from Port Chicago, that we shouldn't be fulfilling that task, but we had no options because we were following orders. So we stayed on that base from September until the event that happened, which was that explosion. But in the interim, working on that base was nothing what you call scab. It was below scab labor. Because what we were doing, we were given no mental or physical training as to what we were doing as far as any type of training in ordnance. We got all our information and direction from the individual who were always there, who was already there on the base loading the ships. And them that were loading the ships at that time were no more high informed or given any training and instructions and ordnance than we were.
Let me take you back for a second. You had applied for schools, various schools.
Right.
Were told that those schools were closed. Had no training. Were shipped to California. No training. To serve as loaders of ammunition. And you essentially received on-the-job training. Okay.
Now, while we were there in California on the base at Port Chicago, we were given instructions as to procedures as far as coming and going. By that I mean as far as the area surrounding us. There's a little city called Port Chicago, and Valdez, and there's another little town I can't remember. But we were getting instruction that you don't go into these places unless you have someone who was above you as far as your rank. All of us were second-class seamen. Now, I'd like to give you a little history as far as the background of the group that I was involved in that went there. We had what I call from the scum of the bottom of a bucket up to 2 and 3 years of individual of college education. But we were all put in that same category. During the process of working there, we worked what you call a 24-hour shift. You work 8 and you're off 16. You work 8 and off 16, you go around the clock. And during the night shift, we had no protection as far as exposure because all the loading is from piers, or you call docks, and you're out in what you call the bay area of the ocean. After we were there about 4 to 5 months, we thought we should have some opportunity to have an increase in rank, have some type of training, or get some type of leave. We were denied all 3. They took some of us and they broke us down and said, okay, we can take and make some of you into a group which they consider as skilled labor. Otherwise, carpenters, mechanics, and there was another one I can't remember offhand. But anyway, that broke our group up. Then they had more individuals who came in from Great Lakes, Illinois under the same circumstances. And because this base was not completely built. When we arrived on that base, it was nothing but 4 barracks, an office, and a mess hall, a place where you eat. And during the process of working there, we did not have an opportunity to have any type of what they call off-duty activity as far as recreation facilities and so forth. And we had to make up our own activities. On March the 17th, 1944 is when this explosion occurred. Now we have.
Before you take the explosion, let me take you back just for a second. You talked about your efforts to get promoted. How did you organize? Because here you have a group of guys that have just been thrown together. What kind of organization did you put together?
Well, we didn't have any organization. We just had what you call a division leader, and he was promoted to a first-class seaman. And we got our instruction from our division leader, who got instruction for the officer who was in charge of the division.
The officers would have been white.
All white officers, no black officers at the time.
And so how would a promotion take place? If you were to get a promotion, the division leader would recommend it?
The division leader would recommend it to the officers in charge of the division. And the officer in charge of the division made that decision who got promotion. And only division leaders, now division leaders were black. Now they got promoted to first-class seamen. All the rest of those were second-class seamen. After we was there about 6 months, then they promoted some of us to first class, but they denied us leave. I emphasize leave because we were there from September until the time of that explosion. None of us was granted leave.
From September to March?
Correct.
And essentially working 8 hours on, 16 hours off. Okay. Let's go to the explosion.
Right. Well, the explosion happened to occur on March the 17th, 1944, but we had put in 8 hours on a regular day shift, and we worked from 8 to 4:30, and 4:30 we're off. After 9:30, when lights are out in the barracks, we were all in the process of getting ourselves what they call bedded in, as we use the term. But boom, we heard this explosion, and without a second thought, we knew exactly what it was, because when we first got at Port Chicago, we would go up to the docks and we had fear of explosion. And those who had been there before we arrived at Port Chicago gave us these simple instructions. He says, you shouldn't have any fear, because if something goes off up here, you're never going to know anything about it. And it was used as a joke, but after we were there for 6 months or more, it was a common thing. We could walk up there anytime, do anything we want, and didn't fear any of that explosion, because that has something we had to brush aside, but we more or less concentrated on why we were being treated the way we were. The officers that were there, they had no idea of the background of associating with blacks, and they had fear of blacks. But we were a group of individuals, like you mentioned a moment ago about who was the leader. We had no leader, but we had individuals who could come out and express themselves. And this was something these officers were not accustomed to. They were accustomed to one approach you salute him, what you're supposed to do, and he said, go jump off that building. You're going to ask him, you know, how high you want me to go up and jump off, you know. But we would follow the direction of asking them, beg your pardon, sir, but why do you want me to do that? They weren't accustomed to that. Whatever the instruction they give you, you're supposed to go ahead and do it. That was their method of dealing with blacks at that time. And then they more or less classify it. And we had a meeting with the whole base in January of '44 in regard to the conduct of the sailors. And this is one of the things they emphasize. You had to have more respect for officers. We didn't respect one officer on that base, but we expect to get the same respect from them as we gave to them. They are above us, but we followed the procedures. We did not disobey or disregard any instruction they gave us, but they tried every way they possibly could to send you in and gear you toward doing something wrong. After the explosion, Well, let me explain about the explosion. The explosion occurred around 9-something, before 10 o'clock. I was in the process of getting in my bunk, I was blowing out of the bunk onto the floor, and an explosion, when it hits something, it has a tendency, the concussion will take things out. And all the glass in the barracks, inside the barracks, went out that way, went out. And on the second floor, so the only thing we could do is get out of the barracks. So I got out of the barracks, and there's 4 of us. We left that base, 4 of us left that base. This is me personally. We left that base that night and walked and ran all the way up to Port Chicago, Port Chicago, little city, Port Chicago, city of Port Chicago, where there's an outgoing Army base up there, incoming outgoing Army base for overseas. And we checked in there. And later on that night, about 2 o'clock in the morning, they shipped a lot of the rest of them up there. They took us from there and they shipped us over into Oakland, California, Oakland Naval Base. And we had a week of rest and doing nothing. And then finally, they asked us to load up on the buses, and they shipped us over to Mare Island. I don't know if you're familiar with Mare Island. That's the little island that sits between Oakland and San Francisco out in the bay. And that evening, they called us out to fall out in formation, which we generally do before each working period. And they asked us, were we going to work? And we said, sure, we're going to work. So when we're out in line, they said, okay, fall in, fall out, and go up to the dock for the areas where the ships were exploding. And didn't no one move. And this was totally shock to the officers in charge. And so the officers in charge of our division came to our leader and asked him, the head boys, to fall out. And we didn't fall out. So they came around and said, are you going to work? And didn't no one say nothing, and didn't no one respond. So they took us and they marched us back to the base. And they took us and put us on a barge and had Marines come out and surround the base as security as far as locking up in the prison. So we stayed there until the next morning. The next day they called us out to the same area, and out in this area at that time we didn't know what was going to happen. And we stood there at attention for about 10 or 15 minutes, and then all of a sudden here comes a automobile with flags, you know, American flag and naval flag on it, and it was the commander of the 12th District Naval Base. We didn't know who it was. So he came around and he marched around and asked each individual who was standing there, he says, are you going to work? Now when he approached me, my comments was to him, I said, yes, I'm going to work, but I'm not going to load no ammunition. And this was what a lot of them said. Now you talking about presupposed. We sat down that night before and said, if anything happened, what you're going to do. And he says, each individual got to make its own decision what he's going to do. So we don't want to say, if you go to work, fine, that's good, that's your problem. But I told the man I was not going to load no ammunition, but I will go to work. So what they did, they took and marched us back to that barge and locked us down, as we said, on that barge. We couldn't leave. And the next day, they had all of us put together, and they took some of it and separated them. And we couldn't figure out what was going on. But in the process, later we found out that they went around and just picked out certain ones, the ones who they had previous problems with when they were at the regular base there in Port Chicago, California. And they took and separated them from us and took us, and they shipped us back over to Oakland, California, and locked us up in the brig. And we couldn't figure out why we were being locked up. But we found out that we were locked up because the NAACP came out there again from Oakland, California, and questioned the reason why. And they said they were locking us up for safekeeping. Now, the other group that they took out, them were the 50 that they court-martialed and said they refused to fall, and no one refused to fall in order because we were never given an order to go to work. as I said a moment ago, there was a question asked us when we were lined up out. Even the commander of that district, he did the same thing. He says, are you going to work? He asked us a question. He didn't give us no order to go to work. And there was a big difference there, and we tried to get this resolved with the peoples in Washington here over all these years, but they come to the conclusion that you did not follow an order. But we were never given an order to go to work. But in the interim, we were locked up in the brig for a little over 3 months. And the only reason, the statement they gave us that we were locked up in the brig is for safekeeping. For safekeeping.
Let me go back for a second. Now, the ones that they identified were those that already had disciplinary records.
Well, not necessarily.
Previously.
Not necessarily.
They just
They
had some
they
problems
had
with
problems
them.
on the base.
They had some problems on the base with them, but they didn't necessarily have disciplinary records from the base.
That's correct. That's correct.
So they identified what they would probably call the troublemakers, and those were the ones that ended up being the ones that were court-martialed.
Yeah, 50 that were court-martialed. And in the process, we tried to figure out, after we were released from the brig, being there over 3 months, we were taken to the docks, put aboard a ship, and shipped overseas with no orders and no direction of where we were going. We didn't know where we were going. And we wound up in New Caledonia. I don't know if you're familiar where that is. That's down there near Australia. It's a French possession. And we had no orders as to what we were doing, where we were. Everywhere we went on the island in the Pacific, we were in general detail. General detail include as going around picking up butts, cleaning up the mess hall, this type of thing.
Yeah, because let's go all the way back. You've never really had any training in terms of a school or anything from you went from not being able to get into a school to being a longshoreman or replacement for longshoreman. And then when the explosion took place, you were held for 3 months for safekeeping, and then shipped out to do general detail work. Is that what you did for the remainder of the war?
That was, well, we shipped out, well, we went from island to island. Every island we went to, it was more or less, they had advance notice. Here they come.
That you were coming.
Yeah, that we're coming. And it was obvious when we got there, we know what the problem were. And they tried to do everything to make us do something that we weren't supposed to do. But in general detail, you do whatever they tell you with. Like I said, you go around clean, sweeping, picking up butts, and this type of thing. And that's what we're doing. We worked in the graveyard. We worked falling trees. We worked in the carpool, changing tires, everything possible. We had no direct assignment as far as the time that we spent overseas. And we went from New Caledonia to New Guinea to the Admiralty Islands. I can't name them all right offhand, but we went to about 7 or 8 different islands we were shipped to during detail work. But I like to emphasize this point is that they said there were white sailors loading ammunition on ships at that time, but I had a friend that I grew up with who was stationed in New Caledonia. At the time, I was in New Caledonia when I rode home, and I found out that he was there. Now, I found out where he was, and I hitched a ride on a truck and went to the base where he was. And guess what they were doing? Unloading ammunition. Unloading ammunition. So this is what more or less the black sailors at that time were doing, the majority. Now, the reason why I went into the Navy, because they said they were going to integrate the Navy. But the little pamphlet, you got a copy of it, and I wrote put in that pamphlet about title integration to be segregated. And that's exactly what happened. You know, they said to integrate the Navy, but they did it on a token basis. They got a few here and a few there, and these different skill school, and all the rest of them, they were prepared to ship them to California or ship them over in the South Pacific on ammunition dumps. That's mainly what
So essentially, in the Army, they call it the supply of service.
Yes, supply service. Infantry.
And to a large extent, what you were doing with maintenance and service kinds of work, and you had anticipated that you would get sort of technical training that just never materialized.
Right, yeah, and the time we spent overseas was what I consider a gap in my life, because I was raised, you know, you can do anything if you want to, you put your time to it and provide the skill. But I was seeing the opposite picture of that when I was being exposed to the thing that the Navy was trying to do. But we were shipped, after Japan surrendered, we were shipped back from overseas to Seattle, Washington, from Seattle, Washington back to Great Lakes, Illinois, and that's where I was discharged.
That's where you mustered out. When you were overseas and going from base to base, again, you had, well, let me go back. What happened to the persons who were in charge of the units, the blacks who were the higher ranking members?
Some of them went back to work. Like I said, when we were there at Mare Island, and the commander of the 12th District Naval Base came and asked us, some of them went back, okay? Now, they said they were going to go low ammunition, and the majority of them who were, which were first class seamen, they didn't go back to work. There were some who were sent back to Port Chicago to clean up, and we refused to go back over there. And my personal opinion of the place, it was one of the worst places I've ever been in my life, and I considered the time that I spent in the Navy was 3 years of my life wasted. It's because when you try to do something to better yourself and you run into a brick wall, and you know that you've been told before you got to that wall that you can go around that wall, but they don't let you go around it. And that's what happened in the Navy.
Now, any notion as to what happened to the white officers who were in charge of
yeah, at the time of the
unit?
explosion, after the explosion, they gave them all leave. Every officer got leave on that base, but they denied each one of us leave. They didn't allow any of us to go and see our family. As far as any, like you say, you have a tragic accident happen in the school or anywhere in the office where you had someone come in as counselor to try to talk to them. Nothing like that happened to us. But after that week, they want us to go back and load ammunition, and refused to do so.
You talked about the NAACP twice. Once they didn't want you to come because they were essentially saying that you're being used as scabs.
Yeah, well, the NAACP had contact with the union there, and the union had informed the Naval Department that it was a dangerous task to have these individuals when they talking about the individuals, they didn't say direct the sailors, black sailors. These individuals, they're speaking of us, to come out there and do that without load that ammunition without any training. The union told them that. And this written information, anyone who want to get it, is right out there in California.
Then after the explosion, the NAACP came in.
Thurgood Marshall.
And Thurgood Marshall, who was later the best known for the Brown versus Topeka school decision case. But they came in then to petition on behalf of the black soldiers.
Correct.
To no avail.
To no avail.
When you got overseas, what kind of activities did you have outside of the general detail that you participated in? What did the soldiers do, not the soldiers, but the sailors do for relaxation?
There was nothing we could do except unless we created our own activity, playing cards and taking the ball and the bat and found somewhere on the base to play ball, something like that. But every base we went to, there were no facilities for us for recreational activities. The
bases had white persons on the base as well.
Yes.
But you were doing the
General
dirty detail.
Mm-hmm.
And basically, what kind of relationships, if any, did you have with the white soldiers?
Well, in relationship with the white sailor, that wasn't the problem. The problem was during the day when you go to work, is they go one way, you go another way, and we know exactly what was happening then. And we were assigned to general detail, and they would go to the unit as far as the different skills they had, they would go to.
Did you get off base?
Well, actually overseas, you know, when we was over doing wartime, you go off base, just go out in the jungle somewhere, you know, overseas.
So there was nothing to...
Oh, yeah, no, only place was in Milan, in the Philippines, and we weren't allowed off base there.
So you played a lot of cards?
Played a lot of cards and talked, and that was about it.
How are you playing whist?
I'm not a card player.
But then you didn't have anything to do.
Well, let me give you an example. Going overseas, yeah, I love the game at that time. And I lost a lot of money on the ship going across seas, which is a reminder that when we're in the process of being shipped across seas, there was a call on the PA system for a yeoman. And we had two in our division who were first class yeoman, third class yeoman, I beg your pardon, third class yeoman. Otherwise, they had been to service school, and they were shipped overseas, but they went with our unit though. But they were being shipped overseas, and they would report up to the area where they told them to come to fill in on the ship while they're going across seas as a yeoman. And every time they went up there, the position was filled. But still, the next day, we were on the PA system, they called for yeoman. So them are the type of things that we went through. And it's funny, you can laugh about now, but at that time, it was a different situation. And but I like to give you a little background as far as myself. You asked me this a while ago. I said I was raised and born in Cincinnati. I went to Taft Elementary School up here in Mount Arthur. And I went to Old High School down on Sycamore Street. And when I graduated from there, I went to the Navy. When I conclude my, what I call my black period, coming back home after I got out of the Navy,
You'd be about 21 then. You went in when you were 18, so you're about 21.
18, I was 21. And I applied, it was Wilberforce University. And I applied there and went to school there and played ball, went 4 years and graduated from Wilberforce.
And a pretty good athlete, right?
Well, average, you know.
A pretty good athlete, right?
I'm like the, if you read this morning's paper, like the young man in there, he says his father didn't brag about things, and he never knew his father was in the Olympics. And I'm the same way. I don't brag. I was good though. But I didn't brag. But I graduated from Central State in 1950, and the following fall I went to graduate school at Columbia University in New York and fulfilled and got my master's in education administration, came on back, and I taught my first year of school in a town called Sedalia, Missouri. I don't know if you're familiar with that or not. And after spending a year in Sedalia, which was, the state was segregated at the time, but you know, at that time, there was segregation and it wasn't. Otherwise, everyone got along fine, but the state law said, you go here, you go there. And I stayed there a year because segregation wasn't my idea of living. And I came back to Cincinnati and applied to Cincinnati Board, got on Cincinnati public school system and stayed there for 39 years. And I taught physical ed as a counselor and a principal. And,
what schools did you work at in CPS?
I started off at Old High School, the school I graduated from. It was called Cutter Junior High School at that time. And I left there and I went to Sawyer Junior High. Mr. Turple was the principal there.
J. Rossman Serpo.
Rossman Turple was principal at the time. I left there. I went to Hughes High School. And I left Hughes High School. I went to Aiken High School as OWE director, and I left.
Occupational work experience.
There you go. And I left there and I went to Crest Hills, which is out in the Rosemont, as assistant principal. Left there and with Roger Effer, and I left there and went back to Aiken High School. And I retired from Aiken High School in 1990, 39 years. And, but my experience in the Navy was a pitiful thing, and I think it also would be the same of any black that was in the Navy at the time. I'll tell you the same thing. They had picked 15, I think it was 15 or 16 black seamen to go in officers training school at that time. I don't know if you're familiar with that.
I'm not familiar with the fact that they picked the 15.
They had them go through officers training school with the intention of hiring just a certain number of them. But they were surprised because when they finished officer training school, all of them came out passing, but they didn't commission all of them officers. They picked a certain number of officers and sent the rest of them back to their unit. That happened.
The fact that it happened does not
There's a book in your
surprise me.
library on
Okay. I assume that when you got out of the service, you used the GI Bill.
Yes, GI Bill.
To pay your way while you were at Central State.
That's correct.
And then you said from Central State to Columbia University to complete the master's, then into well, actually 1 year then out of state, and then back to Cincinnati to the public school system, and 39 years there. Ben Waterman.
Yes, played ball, Ben.
Ben tells me he was a pretty good basketball player.
He was average. He played football and
football, baseball. And actually, Ben was one of the first African-American coaches. He was assistant basketball coach at Taft High School.
High school. Stargell did.
And Willard Stargell also. So actually, there were very few African-American teachers in the Cincinnati public school system, and none at the high school when you started, when you started in the system. You want to talk a little bit about that?
Well, I had the experience myself of being involved in it because when I first went and applied for a position in Cincinnati Public School, I was denied. And the reason why I was denied because I had no teacher's experience. And there was a friend of mine I knew from high school that he was living in Western Hills, but he went to UC, played football at UC, and he had a bachelor's degree. I had a master's degree, and he got a job, but I didn't. We never could figure that out.
He lived in Western Hills?
He doesn't live in Western Hills.
So he was white.
But Western Hills didn't have anything to do. That's where he lived at the time. But we went to high school there. He lived downtown at the time then. And the first year back here in Cincinnati after I left Sedalia, Missouri, and came back, I was on limbo for a year, but I was sub-teaching because I was denied an opportunity. So the first job I had in Cincinnati Public School as a regular teacher was a part-time teaching job. Every time I applied, Mr. Pierce, I don't know, Wendell Pierce, at that time, and he had the nerve enough to tell me that I had too much education. And so that was the thing that I dealt with. But I was given a part-time job, and the reason I got it is Cleo Wingard.
Cleo Wingard.
I don't know if you remember him. He was at Old Woodward High School, and they called me and said I had an option. And in the interim, I had to work. I was working at the post office, and he called me down there for an interview. And junior high school, they called me for an interview. So I went to both of them, and Cleo Wingard says, if you want to come here, no problem, you can come. I said, okay. I said, but the amount of money that I will be making is not going to cover me because I'm working at the post office. He said, that's no problem. Now, I was working at the post office from 3 to 11:30 in the evening. And schools at that time in the Cincinnati public school system, all schools open and closes at the same time, elementary through high school. And high school, they ran from 8:30 to 3 o'clock. So Mr. Wingard, he made it possible to start teaching and working on another job at the same time by making my last period free. And at 2 o'clock, Mr. Wingard said, what you do is you get your stuff and you leave and go on home and go to your other job. And I had to make the mistake of doing this, and every day when I got ready to leave, I go down to the office, and we had to punch a clock then, and punch a clock and leave. So about 2 weeks later, Mr. Wingard called me back into his office and says, he said, hey, Tuggle, what are you trying to do, make a fool out of me? And I said, no, sir. And he says, why do you come to this office and punch out every day? I said, that's what you told me to do. He said, no, I didn't tell you. I told you to go ahead and leave every day. But the teacher complained about me leaving every day. And I was one of 3 black teachers in the whole school at that time. And this was Old Woodward High School, which was then changed into Cutter Junior High School at the time. And
now the School for the Creative and Performing Arts.
It's the School for Creative and Performing Arts. But that is my experience of dealing with my upbringing. And it's a pivotal thing when your parents tell you one thing, you go out and you meet the world, and it's just the opposite. And so I don't regret it, and I don't regret it to today, and I feel the same thing. 3 years I spent in service was a waste of my life. There's a time period, what I call a black period. It was a waste of time. Because I couldn't do what I wanted to do.
Well, what else? Family?
My family, I have a beautiful wife. She is the daughter of a young man who was passed called Sky Johnson, had a restaurant, a pharmacy down 5th and John, Sky's Restaurant Pharmacy. You don't remember that?
Don't remember it.
That's a little before his time.
Well, probably not, because I came to Cincinnati in 1942.
Oh yeah, well that's before his time.
And lived at 1204 West 7th Street.
I have 3 daughters. I have 2 grandchildren. I have a daughter who's a medical doctor in Columbus, internal medicine. I have a daughter in Arlington, Texas, who was a buyer from Marcus Neiman, and I have a daughter here in Cincinnati. All things, she's teaching school.
Where's she teaching?
She's at North College Hill.
North College Hill.
She lived in North College, but she's at College Hill Elementary.
Okay.
They're over on North Bend Road now. So that's the family life.
Well, I thank you very, very much. Is there anything that I should have asked you that I didn't ask you?
No, that's about it. I appreciate you giving me the opportunity to express myself, because we're at the point now, when I say we are, there are about between 15 and 20 of us who were out there in California during that time of the explosion are still alive.
Do you keep in touch with each other?
But we try to keep in touch, but it's a process where we got the legal representative in the state of California. See, that explosion happened in California, so anything legally that occurs got to occur in California. And we've been through the process. We've been out there 4 or 5 times and been up to Sacramento, to Cap, express our opinion and everything. But still, no one will take the opportunity. I tried to get Stan Chesley, the lawyer here, and we had him come in and speak to us. And he said it's a case that is iffy. And when you say iffy, it's a political thing. You know, if you do that, you know, something's going to happen. And the only thing we did, we got, or had the opportunity to have one interview expunged, his record expunged. And he was ill at the time. and they use the legal procedures, or as you say, to counteract and keep from doing something in order to appease everyone on both sides, like you said, appease everyone. Clinton came here. I saw Clinton over at the airport, and Stan Chesley asked me would I present the copy of that book I gave you. I gave to President Clinton. And he went through the process of following through on the directive from California, and he expunged one sailor. And this is on our records. Those that were court-martialed. Now, I was supposed to have been court-martialed, but I have never went before nobody and had an opportunity to present my side of the story. All of those, there was almost 300 of those. These are the individuals who you hear nothing about. There was almost 300 they shipped overseas. Well, I was speaking about a moment ago. And we were never given a court-martial. But I wrote to St. Louis, Missouri, where you can write and get your service record. I wrote there and got my service record, and on there they have them. I was court-martialed. But we have never been before no governing body or court body and was given a direct order for anything. But we were court-martialed according to our record.
Now, but you have an honorable discharge.
I have an honorable discharge, yes.
And so far as you know, the other 300, unless they got into some difficulty after the Port Chicago explosion, would have gotten honorable discharges.
Actually, the 50 who were court-martialed, they didn't spend the time, but they were released from prison. And eventually, they all got honorable discharges. But that is still on their record.
Yeah.
Now, the information on your record is supposed to include everything from the day you entered the service up to the point when you're discharged. But we happen to find out that when we left Great Lakes, Illinois, and after being tested to see what service school we like to go into, and we look on our record, there's nothing on our records about the scores or anything, nothing on there. So I think this is one of the things that they did in order to say, well, they didn't do anything, anything to get into service school. But that's what happened.
So there was one serviceman that had his record expunged.
Yeah, had to take it off record.
Right.
But he died. He was ill. He died. See, and Clinton did that. And so that's where we're at right now. But we can't get no one to stand behind us and go to Washington and say this was wrong, and there should be an apology, or a record should be expunged. They got on there that I was court-martialed and given a summary court-martial, and I was fine.
But you never.
I've never been before an official body and says you're being court-martialed. It's on my record.
Well, this has been a delight, a pleasure, and informative. And on behalf of the Cincinnati and Hamilton County Public Library of Cincinnati, Ohio, I'd like to thank you.
Thank you for having me for interview. Thank you.